In June 1938, a wealthy American zoologist named Richard Archbold was piloting his flying boat over the uncharted interior of Dutch New Guinea. He broke through a wall of clouds and saw something that did not exist on any map: a vast, populated valley stretching nearly 30 miles long, filled with thousands of villages, fenced gardens, and tens of thousands of Stone Age farmers. Archbold called it the Grand Valley, but the maps called it blank space. He landed his plane on a nearby lake, and within weeks, Dutch soldiers and scientists were walking among the natives, men in penis gourds, women in fiber skirts, all of them living in a world without metal, without the wheel, without any knowledge of the war that would soon consume the entire planet. The outside world took little notice, and the valley faded back into obscurity. 6 years later, in May 1944, Colonel Ray Elsmore of the United States Army Air Forces flew over the same valley with Major Myron Grimes. They believed they were the first outsiders ever to see it. They photographed the round huts, the watchtowers, the river disappearing into a hole in the mountain wall. Elsmore wrote secret memos about headhunters and cannibals, proposing a landing strip, until he realized the natives were too dangerous and the terrain too difficult. War correspondents soon gave the place a name that stuck: Shangri-La, after James Hilton's fictional paradise in Lost Horizon, a peaceful utopia sealed from the outside world. But the valley was anything but peaceful. Its alliances fought endless wars to satisfy the spirits of the dead, and the real Shangri-La was a land of perpetual conflict, not a refuge from it. By May of 1945, the valley known as Shangri-La had become a sightseeing destination for troops at the sprawling American base in Hollandia. On Sunday, May 13th, a restless WAC corporal named Margaret Hastings sat at her desk in the headquarters tent of the Far East Air Service Command after a morning of typing reports. She had been in New Guinea for 5 months and had never seen the legendary valley from the air. Her commanding officer, Colonel Peter Prosson, had promised his staff a treat that afternoon: a flight over the hidden valley. Prosson spent that morning writing a Mother's Day letter to his wife in Texas, telling her he tried to relieve the strain on his people. The plane for the flight was a C-47 transport fitted with standard survival gear that included a yellow life raft. 11 days after the flight, a Western Union messenger approached a green farmhouse on McMaster Street in Owego, New York. Inside lived Patrick Hastings, a 68-year-old widower whose daughter served in the Women's Army Corps. The telegram he carried read simply: the War Department regretted to inform him that Corporal Margaret Hastings was missing in Dutch New Guinea. When Patrick Hastings called his younger daughters, he cut through the military jargon and reduced the message to 3 words: Margaret is missing. At 2:15 that afternoon, the C-47 transport known as the Gremlin Special rumbled past the palm trees lining the Sentani airstrip. On board were 24 members of the United States military, including 9 WACs. Margaret Hastings had dashed to the plane and grabbed a seat near the tail for the best view, then jumped up and moved again when she realized the forward windows looked straight down onto the wings. The plane lifted off into a clear blue sky, setting a course 224 degrees southwest, straight toward the valley. As the Gremlin Special cruised toward Shangri-La, Colonel Prosson made a fateful decision. He unbuckled his seatbelt and walked back into the cabin to mingle with his staff, leaving the co-pilot, Major George Nicholson, alone at the controls. Nicholson had learned to fly only 3 years earlier and had been overseas for just 4 months. Neither man had ever flown into the valley before, and all they knew about the treacherous mountain pass came from rumors and second-hand reports. Nearly an hour into the flight, Nicholson guided the plane into a narrow side valley. Jungle-covered mountains flanked the C-47 on both sides, and clouds filled the air ahead. Through the whiteness, First Lieutenant John McCullum, a passenger sitting near the tail, saw snatches of dark green jungle covering a mountain he estimated at 12 or 13,000 feet. He shouted toward the cockpit, "Give her the gun and let's get out of here." Nicholson pulled back on the control wheel and thrust the throttles forward, but the plane could not climb fast enough. Gremlin Special sheared the tops of giant tropical evergreens, their limbs and leaves smacking against the camouflage-painted skin. The distance between the C-47 and the unforgiving terrain closed to 0. Metal, twisted glass shattered, fuel ignited, and the plane slammed into the jungle-covered mountainside. The cabin crumpled forward, both wings ripped away, and flames shot through the wreckage. 19 died instantly or within moments of the crash. Of the 5 who survived the initial impact, 2 more would die in the coming days, bringing the final toll to 21. John McCullum came to on his hands and knees halfway up the cabin, surrounded by flames. Driven by instinct, he crawled toward a flash of white light where the tail had been and tumbled out onto the scorched earth. Rising to his feet, he thought about his twin brother Robert and the 22 others still trapped inside. He told himself, "This is a heck of a place to be, 165 miles from civilization, all by myself on a Sunday afternoon." Margaret Hastings had bounced through the cabin like a rubber ball, landing on top of a dead man whose arms had locked around her in death. She pried herself loose, crawled toward the torn-open rear of the fuselage, and stumbled out onto the jungle floor. McCullum spotted her and called out, then heard another WAC screaming from inside the burning plane. Without hesitating, he scrambled back inside and let out Sergeant Laura Besley, then carried Private Eleanor Hanna, whose hair still crackled with burning embers. McCullum could not go back a third time. The fire raged too high and explosions echoed from inside the wreckage. He looked up and saw a man walking woozily toward him from around the right side of the plane, Tech Sergeant Kenneth Decker, a 34-year-old draftsman who had been celebrating his birthday aboard the flight. A bloody gash, several inches long, exposed the gray bone of his skull. His right arm hung stiff from a broken elbow, and burns seared both his legs. Yet somehow he was on his feet, muttering, "Haluva way to spend your birthday." The 5 survivors gathered on a small rock ledge 20 yards from the wreckage, catching their breath as rain soaked through their clothes and chilled them to the bone. McCullum and Decker climbed back to the plane and salvaged what they could from the detached tail section: a deflated life raft, 2 heavy tarpaulins, a first aid kit, a signaling mirror, and 17 small cans of water. Their only food was charms, fruit-flavored hard candies. By the second night, Eleanor Hanna had died from her burns, and Laura Besley had succumbed to internal injuries. McCullum wrapped their bodies in tarpaulins and laid them at the foot of a tree. The remains of Laura Besley and the other 20 victims would later be recovered and returned to their families. 3 survivors remained: John McCullum, the stoic lieutenant from Missouri who had just lost his twin brother, Kenneth Decker, the sergeant from Washington with a terrible head wound, and Margaret Hastings, the WAC corporal from New York with burnt legs and a cut hand. They had known each other only casually around the base, but now they were bound by a shared horror. McCullum, the least injured and highest ranking, became their natural leader. On the 3rd morning, McCullum announced they had to move. Their burns were already turning gangrenous, and hiding under the jungle canopy meant certain death if search planes could not spot them. He led them into a dry creek bed that angled sharply down the mountain, forcing them to climb, slide, and jump down rocky slopes. When they reached a 12-foot waterfall too steep to descend, McCullum grabbed a thick vine, swung over the cascading water, and let himself down at the bottom. Margaret Hastings followed without hesitation, and Decker came after, deadpanning with a Western drawl. "Damned if I ever thought I'd understudy Johnny Weissmuller." McCullum said nothing about the broken rib he had suffered when he slipped while carrying Eleanor Hanna. Late on the 3rd day, they reached a clearing high on the mountainside, a sweet potato garden cut from the surrounding jungle. The next morning, a B-17 Flying Fortress roared overhead, and McCullum spread out the yellow tarpaulin from the life raft. The pilot, Captain William Baker, wagged his wings to confirm he had seen them, then radioed Hollandia. 3 people in khaki, waving, spotted in a small clearing about 10 air miles from the valley floor. For the first time since the crash, they laughed and danced and screamed with relief. Their joy was short-lived. An hour after the B-17 flew off, the jungle came alive with strange yapping sounds that grew closer. Dozens of nearly naked men emerged from behind the curtain of leaves, their bodies glistening with soot and pig grease, their hands filled with stone adzes and wooden spears. McCullum barked at his companions. "Smile as you've never smiled before, and pray to God it works." They held out their remaining charms and McCullum's pocket knife as peace offerings, forcing grins onto their terrified faces. A wiry older man stepped forward, naked except for a long penis gourd and a necklace with a narrow piece of shell. McCullum met him halfway on a fallen log that bridged a gully between them, grasped his hand, and pumped it like a long-lost relative. The native leader, Wimayuk Wandik, shook hands with Hastings and Decker as well, and soon the rest of his men followed. Wandik examined their wounds, leaned close, and blew directly into the gash on Decker's scalp and the burns on Hastings' legs. The survivors did not understand it, but Wandik was coaxing their souls back to their proper place. They had just received a remarkable gift from the people they had been taught to fear: acceptance and a desire for them to live. Back at the sprawling American base in Hollandia, a restless captain waited for war. Earl Walter Jr. had trained Filipino-American paratroopers for months, but no mission came. His father, Earl Walter Sr., was a guerrilla leader in the Philippines, and he had quietly asked commanders not to use his son in dangerous work. The young captain fumed at the inaction, his unit's motto, "Bahala na, come what may," feeling like a hollow taunt. Then a former teacher entered the picture. Lieutenant Colonel John Babcock, who had taught biology at the Black Fox Military Institute, now worked in planning for the Army Air Forces. When word of the crashed Gremlin Special reached him, Babcock remembered his old student. He found Earl Walter Jr. and explained the situation. 3 survivors stranded in an uncharted valley, surrounded by reputed headhunters. Walter listened, then saw his chance. Far from Hollandia, in a sweet potato garden high in the mountains, the 3 survivors began their 4th day with the Yali people. Wimayuk Wandik returned at dawn, carrying a bundle of cooked sweet potatoes. He built a small fire and gestured for the weary Americans to eat. McCollum accepted gratefully, sharing the warm food with Hastings and Decker. The natives no longer hid in the jungle. Women and children crept closer, staring at the pale, wounded spirits. Wimayuk squatted beside them, patient and calm. He had decided that these visitors from the sky deserved protection, not fear. The survivors began to breathe a little easier that afternoon. A C-47 droned overhead and circled the clearing. A voice crackled from the 2-way radio that had just been parachuted in. McCollum picked up the handset and spoke. The radio man, Sergeant Jack Gutsight, asked for a report. McCollum swallowed and told the truth. 21 dead, only 3 survivors. Supply crates tumbled from the plane, parachutes blossoming above the jungle. One heavy box missed its mark. It crashed through the thatched roof of a native hut, landing squarely on a pig tethered outside. The animal belonged to a girl named Yungukwe, and its death shattered her trust. She wept and raged at the sky spirits who had brought this ruin. The next morning, Captain Earl Walter Jr. stood before his men. He told them what the rescue would require: 10 volunteers for a parachute jump into a valley marked unknown on every map. The drop zone would be thick jungle. The natives might prove hostile. Worst of all, no extraction plan existed. They would have to hike out through swamps or enemy-held coast. Walter finished his warning and asked for volunteers. Without a word, every man in the unit raised his hand. Each one stepped forward. The captain nodded, feeling a surge of pride. "Bahala na," several murmured. "Come what may." Their mission was set. Back in the garden clearing, the survivors' bodies were failing. Hastings' legs and Decker's backside had turned black with wet gangrene. McCollum did what he could with the limited medical supplies from the supply drop, ointment and clean bandages, but the infection spread. Hastings could barely stand now. Decker could not walk at all. Wimayuk Wandik continued to bring food and fire each day. He saw their suffering and blew softly on their wounds again, trying to coax their souls back into balance. Not all of his people were convinced. Some whispered that the spirits meant the end of days, as the old legends foretold, but most villagers simply watched, waiting to see what the new world would bring. On the morning of May 22nd, Captain Earl Walter Jr. and 10 paratroopers from the 1st Reconnaissance Battalion climbed into a C-47 transport at Sentani Airstrip. Among them were 2 medics, Sergeant John Crick and Private First Class Paul Crickow, carrying canvas bags packed with penicillin and sulfa drugs. The plane droned south over the Orange Mountains, following the same canyon that had swallowed the Gremlin Special 9 days earlier. Walter scanned the jungle below, knowing that somewhere under that green canopy, 3 wounded Americans were waiting. The jump itself was a gamble. The drop zone was a narrow patch of sweet potato garden ringed by 100-foot trees, barely large enough for a safe landing. Walter went first, his chute snapping open above the clearing. One by one, the others followed, steering their parachutes through gaps in the canopy. They hit the ground hard, but without serious injury. Minutes later, Walter found the 3 survivors huddled under a yellow tarp. Hastings and Decker lay motionless, their bandages black with gangrene. Crick knelt beside them, swabbed the wounds, and began the first real medical treatment they had received since the crash. By dawn the next day, the rescue team faced a brutal decision. Hastings could not stand. Decker could not walk. The only way out was to carry them. The men fashioned 2 litters from saplings and parachute cloth, lashing the wounded securely between the poles. Wimayuk Wandik and his Yali villagers watched the preparations, then stepped forward without being asked. They hacked paths through the vine-choked jungle with stone adzes, clearing a route that led down the mountainside. In exchange for this labor, Walter traded metal tools, axes and machetes dropped in earlier supply loads, which the natives accepted with quiet wonder. The column moved slowly, yard by yard. 4 paratroopers carried each litter, trading off every hour as the trail steepened. Rain fell in sheets, turning the ground to glue. Wimayuk's men ranged ahead, calling out warnings where the earth crumbled into ravines. Crick and Crickow moved between the litters, checking pulse points and dosing the wounded with sulfa tablets crushed into their drinking water. Hastings drifted in and out of consciousness. Decker said nothing. McCullum, his broken ribs still untended, walked at the rear of the column, keeping watch. On the 9th day, the jungle parted. The column emerged onto the floor of the Balium River Valley, a vast flatland of kunai grass and scattered huts. The change was immediate. The air warmed, the ground firmed. Walter chose a grove of trees near the river as a base camp. He ordered the litters set down in the shade, and for the first time in 2 weeks, Hastings and Decker lay on solid ground. A small canvas tent went up to shelter them from the sun. Around them, hundreds of Dani villagers gathered at a cautious distance, their spear points above the grass. The original rescue plan had called for a glider to land on the valley floor, but the terrain was too rough and the winds too unpredictable. Word arrived from Colonel Elsmore of an audacious plan developed by Air Commando pilots, an aerial snatch system using a hook and line. A C-47 trailing a 120-foot nylon rope could sweep low, snag a cable held by men on the ground, and haul the survivors into the plane before the same trees that had killed the Gremlin Special could reach them. Walter set the ground preparations in motion. He ordered the largest clearing enlarged, putting the Dani to work with machetes, burning the cut grass in heaps. Smoke rose over the valley, a signal that the next phase had begun. Colonel Elsmore gave the order on June the 9th. The Snatch plan was authorized. A C-47 would trail a 120-foot nylon line with a heavy hook dangling from its tail. On the ground, Dani villagers would hold the line taut between 2 stout poles. It was a system never tried in combat, and the margin for error was razor thin. Captain Walter gathered the Dani men around the cleared field. He demonstrated through gestures what they had to do: grip the rope and pull it tight the instant the plane passed overhead. The villagers nodded, their spears planted in the ground. One woman placed a basket of sweet potatoes near the wounded, then melted back into the crowd. The morning of June the 12th broke clear over the valley. The rescue party positioned Decker and Hastings on litters near the center of the field. McCollum and Walter stood ready to run to the pickup point after the first catch. The Dani men took their stations, hands wrapped around the nylon rope. Everyone watched the empty sky. The C-47 appeared over the ridge at low altitude. It descended until its wheels nearly brushed the kunai grass. The hook swung beneath the fuselage. The pilot held steady as the plane roared over the line. The hook caught the rope cleanly, and the line snapped taut. But this was only a test. An empty barracks bag was tied to the sling. It jerked into the air, rose smoothly, and was hauled aboard. The Dani men relaxed their grip. The system worked. This time Decker was strapped into the sling. The plane came low again. The hook snagged the rope, and Decker was hoisted into the air, spinning slowly as he ascended. Hands reached from the cargo door and pulled him inside. The Dani men reset the line. For the third pass, Hastings was strapped into the sling. The plane dropped down, the hook caught the rope, and she rose from the ground. The nylon line frayed under the strain, but it held long enough for her to be hauled aboard before it could part. McCollum and Walter remained on the ground. The Dani men scrambled to retie a hand loop to the shortened rope for a fourth pass. The plane dropped down once more, the hook caught the rope, and both men grabbed hold. They were dragged across the grass and lifted into the air, their boots clearing the treetops by feet. Inside the cargo bay, they rolled onto the metal floor, gasping. The entire extraction had taken less than 4 minutes. Back in Hollandia, the 3 survivors were rushed to the base hospital. Decker, still dazed from his head wound, was wheeled into surgery. A nurse leaned over his bed and whispered, "Happy birthday." He blinked and managed a weak smile. A tray with cake and coffee appeared beside him. For the first time in a month, he was safe. Margaret Hastings recovered in the base hospital. Her gangrene treated and her wounds healing, and returned to her father's house in Owego. John McCollum carried his twin brother's ring home to Missouri and helped raise Robert's infant daughter. Kenneth Decker endured several surgeries but eventually regained his health. Captain Earl Walter Jr. remained in the Army. His father's earlier fears outweighed by a job well done. The Filipino-American paratroopers of the 1st Reconnaissance Battalion returned to duty. Medics John Crick and Paul Krikow were commended for their life-saving work. Lieutenant Colonel John Babcock was recognized for planning the rescue, and pilots William Baker and radioman Jack Gutsight returned to their units. In the valley, the Wandick family went back to their gardens. Yungukwe Wandick eventually accepted a new pig from the Americans. Her anger cooled into a wary peace. The rope had been restrung. For the Danny and the Yali, the outside world would never be a legend again. If you or someone in your family has a story from this era, a memory of a veteran or a scrap of a letter, we would love to hear it in the comments below. Please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like to help us bring more of these forgotten histories to light. Thank you for listening.